Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our new podcast, Classical Discoveries. Today, I would say we have a very political, classical discoveries. I'm right?
Grammatically, no, but thematically, yes.
Thematically, okay. What is grammatically right?
I don't know if we have a classical discoveries, the political edition.
So Jens, let me know, where have you been when the wall break down or the wall fall down?
Came down.
Came down, okay.
I presume that I was behind the TV somewhere ensconced in the south of West Germany. I remember a couple years before that, in the workshop with my dad, hearing the news about Reagan's speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall.
Yeah.
And I remember asking my dad whether he thought the wall would ever come down. And he said, not in my lifetime. And ironically, he died in February of '89, so he was right. But we saw it, and of course, it did happen. And where were you?
Honestly, I was exactly on that day that I also was in front of the TV, but 2 months before, as I said, when Genscher was on the balcony in Hungary, I stayed in Western Berlin, and I stayed in the RIAS. In the RIAS was the Radio im amerikanischen Sektor, how to say, the American radio there, the kind of West propaganda radio, so they put all the good things to East Germany there, and they had to listen to a lot of tapes from the archive there, and suddenly when that happened, and they come in the next day to the radio station, I had my own little studio. I said, "We are so sorry. There are so many changes. You cannot work anymore here." So no one was interested in that days for classical music and archive and so for sure. The funny thing was when I stayed in West Berlin, I could watch the West TV and also the East TV, the East television, the Aktuelle Kamera. And in the Western there was a big jubilee and great. Wow, they can go over and in the Aktuelle Kamera, the East television, these bad people of the DDR, they are traitors, they have to go in prison and blah, blah, blah. So there was suddenly in front, I just had to switch on 2 channels and there was suddenly totally complete 2 other worlds. But anyway, this what we now want to search or discover a bit was, before the years, how the music life, how the musicians lived there, or the question which problems the musicians had, or...
And well, let's find out. How do you propose we go about this?
For example, this was the idea why we do this all here today, because I found a very old CD. It's called Der Mauerfall, or how you say in English,
Well, as the wall came down, you might
as
say.
the wall came down. So as the wall came down, Der Mauerfall. And I had some interesting interviews 10 years ago with performers from the GDR, like Olaf, like Christine Schornsheim, Rainer Goldberg, and so on. We just wanted to save a bit these voices for the future. How was their life? So I cut down a bit the interviews to the most interesting passages for this point, and I would like to start now with education.
Ich wollte unbedingt Heldentenor werden und wie Sie wissen, ich wurde nicht Heldentenor, ich wurde Countertenor oder Altist oder wie man es auch gerne bezeichnen möchte. Ja, und da wurde ich vom Fleck weg engagiert in die Komische Oper. Obwohl man noch gar nicht wusste, ob man etwas mit mir anfangen konnte. Denn welches Opernhaus leistet sich schon so einen Exoten wie mich? Und diese Chance habe ich mit beiden Händen gepackt. Wir sind alle ins kalte Wasser gesprungen. Ich, meine Gesangslehrerin, der Chefregisseur der Komischen Oper Harry Kupfer, der Intendant, der das alles vor dem Ministerium vertreten musste, auch meine Gage und alles. Und ich dachte, die haben jetzt so viel Vertrauen in dich gesetzt, die darfst du jetzt einfach nicht enttäuschen.
Unser Studium dauerte 5 Jahre. Nach dem 4. Studienjahr gab es ein zentrales Vorsingen aller Absolventen des folgenden Jahres vor Regisseuren, Intendanten, Dirigenten und so weiter. Und man bekam dort ein Stellenangebot, wo man dann vorsingen musste. Also das ging dann ganz normal, wie überall. Aber das garantierte jedem eine Stelle nach dem Studium. Und das war natürlich die Sicherheit, einen Arbeitsplatz zu bekommen. Und dann auch diese 3 Jahre, wo man also sich noch ein bisschen ausprobieren konnte, überhaupt Praxis erstmal begreifen konnte. Das war natürlich im Vergleich zu heute ein großes Geschenk.
Ich meine, die Theater mussten bespielt werden. Es wurde nach Sängern gesucht. Es war eine Verpflichtung, wenn Sie in der DDR studiert haben, dass Sie in den ersten 3 Jahren wurden Sie an ein Theater verpflichtet und Sie mussten dorthin gehen. Wo es überall Theater gab, das war unglaublich und dort wurden überall Solisten gebraucht. Das war wirklich erstaunlich und insofern hat vieles unter anderen Voraussetzungen stattgefunden.
Wir hatten 4 Musikhochschulen gehabt. Die befanden sich in Ostberlin, in Dresden, Leipzig und in Weimar. Das Lehrerkonsortium aus diesen Hochschulen, die bildeten eine sogenannte ständige Jury, wenn es darum ging, zu internationalen Wettbewerben zu gehen, Empfehlungen auszusprechen. Es gab Vorspiele vor der sogenannten ständigen Jury, die fanden meistens in Leipzig statt. Und wenn man dann Zuschlag bekommen hat, dann wurde eingereicht beim sogenannten Kulturministerium, dann wurde geprüft, ist derjenige würdig, ich sage mal in Gänsefüßchen, politisch würdig, entsendet zu werden. Und insofern denke ich, natürlich ist man benutzt worden. Also das war ja einfach Sinn und Zweck, dass man Künstler oder Sportler dann einfach hat entsendet, um sich damit zu schmücken, um gegebenenfalls die Staatskasse dann mit entsprechenden Geldern dann aufzufüllen.
It's interesting. I hear out from these comments that the art or the music, maybe general the art, had a very high reputation in the GDR. No?
Right, I think Olaf, who was one of the really most interesting voices on that CD I found, says that at some point that the GDR knew they weren't going to compete on cars and television sets, but on culture and sports, as it were, with a little chemical help, they were able to compete. And that was something that they could export, and that's how they could get prestige in the world. And they had their version of the traditional German culture, which of course was valued there as much as it was in the West, if not more. And that's, I guess, part of how the state, got justification, for its existence.
Of course, no one wanted a Trabi from the GDR, but maybe they wanted to listen to Peter Schreier in the Wiener Musikverein. And the other thing I hear out of this is, they must have so many orchestras and so many theaters. So when someone finished his studies, then it was sure that he get a job.
Which makes you think, no matter how good you were?
It depends on how good you are. If you're a really good violinist, then you came maybe to the Staatskapelle.
Yes, you would be assigned to different orchestras.
Yeah. And if you're a middle player or a worse player, then you come to Chemnitz or Rostock somewhere in the last row. But you had a job. For sure you had a job, This is something I think in our times would be a dream if we can guarantee all the students that they
I'm not sure how many people dream of playing second violin in Chemnitz, but no disrespect, it's actually a fine orchestra, Robert Schumann Philharmonic. But it's as interesting as it is to hear in a foreign language people talk about their experience. You worked a lot with those artists, with all of them, or most of them anyway. You worked in the GDR. The first important release that Capriccio ever brought out was a GDR product. That was the Herbert Kegel Beethoven cycle. So in a way, you're part of that history.
No, I can jump out. This is good for artistic. I can do. If you No, have to do here. So
There it is.
Beethoven. I mean, for Capriccio at that time, we have been a little recording company, you know, and of course it was for us much cheaper to do productions there in the GDR, and they had amazing, wonderful musicians, you know. And on the other side, the bad thing was we had to pay to the ministry in West German, Marks, German money, and the musicians then got from the ministry the East German version, the East German money. But anyway, they got more than in the normal daily work in the Konzerthaus or somewhere in this thing, you know.
Right. So, but that basically is Capriccio 0 hour. We talked about it in the 40th anniversary interview we did a while ago for the label. It's the first digitally recorded Beethoven cycle ever made.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it sold well, presumably, right?
It's what?
It sold well.
Yeah, it was before Karajan. We had the luck before Karajan coming out. And in that time, I mean, today, my son would laugh about what CD, but that time CD was something amazing. Whoa!
Right.
This is...
And reading a little bit about it and looking at my favorite conductors in East Germany, I found out not only did the East Germany produce the first digitally recorded Beethoven cycle, which is this one, and that's from Dresden, right, with the Dresden Philharmonic. They also produced the first Beethoven cycle ever issued on CD. Okay. Of course, I forgot which one. I think it's Ottmar Suitner's.
Ottmar Suitner, yeah.
And the VEB would record on one side of wherever they recorded, and then Japanese companies would record digitally already later on.
When was it? It's still fresh. I think looks like I never listened to that, but I had more copies of it, of course, you know. But I can tell you exactly now because here's Mr. Kegel. So let's see. I can tell you exactly now. This was done. Aufnahme recording 1982.
You weren't there at the recording.
No,
You just licensed it.
No, we had a contract with the VEB Deutsche Schallplatte. We make co-productions, and they deal with the LPs and CDs in the East countries, and we deal in the West countries. Right. So that's why a lot of GDR artists, they make the recordings there. They come now to the West between Capriccio and to Capriccio things. Yeah.
But you dealt with the officials, obviously. You were
of course.
Of negotiations. How did that feel? Well,
I mean, it was always a bit tricky. Honestly, I have to say that that time the GDR always made my former boss. I always had to do Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary, you know, because as an Austrian, I didn't have to pay any visa to Bulgaria. So he said, Johannes, you make Bulgaria, you know.
So that was your beat, as it were.
But he also had 2-3 passports, you know, always going there and there. I mean, and I remember in the office we had this old telex apparat. You know, it was before fax, the telex, but it's you know, these messages come from behind the wall. But this is now our second question. If you are on the top in the GDR, how much artists were used for propaganda things in the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, in the GDR? I also have some short excerpts here from the interviews.
Also, dass die Kultur in der DDR eine andere Bedeutung hatte, das steht außer Frage. Natürlich hätte die Staatsführung der DDR es gerne gesehen, dass alle Künstler sozusagen sich als Sprachrohr der Staatsführung verstehen. Und so ist es ja auch gewesen. Also ich meine, der Trompeter Ludwig Güttler, der Kammersänger Professor Peter Schreier, der Theo Adam, Jochen Kowalski, meine Person und viele andere, die sind natürlich in Anführungsstrichen benutzt worden. Ich habe den Begriff Aushängeschild schon mal formuliert. Das war die Kunst und Kultur und der Sport. Damit konnte die DDR im internationalen Vergleich mithalten. Ganz bestimmt nicht mit der Wirtschaft.
Die DDR hat einige Künstler nicht etwa rausgelassen, weil sie so ein großes Herz für die Künstler hatte, sondern weil es natürlich dem Ruf diente. Wir waren ja dann sozusagen Aushängeschilder, noch mehr waren es die Sportler. Das war etwas, womit man im Westen angeben konnte. Also das war der eine Grund. Und der andere Grund, wie immer, natürlich das Geld. Wir mussten ja einen nicht unerheblichen Teil des Geldes dann in der DDR wieder abliefern. Nichts hat die DDR mehr als Devisen gebraucht.
Es gehörte auch dazu, dass der DDR-Staat und die SED sich bemühte, Künstler für ihre Zwecke einzusetzen. Sprich, es gab einen erheblichen Teil der Kunst, die der politischen Propaganda nahe war oder die man eigentlich Propagandakunst nennen könnte, also wo die sozialistische Gesellschaft sozusagen in schönsten Farben dargestellt wurde. Sie wollten also die Unterstützung der Kultur und der Kunst für ihre staatlichen und politischen Ziele.
Und was ausgenutzt wurde, das ist die Qualität, die einzelne Leute hatten. Und nicht nur einzelne Leute, sondern auch die Staatskapelle Dresden. Auch dieses Orchester oder das Gewandhausorchester Leipzig und Kurt Masur, auch das waren sozusagen Mittler der DDR-Kultur. Und die Oberen der DDR haben natürlich das als ihr Selbstverständnis begriffen, dass diese Ensembles, der Dresdner Kreuzchor, der Thomaner Chor, dass sie die DDR repräsentieren.
So I think I hear a bit out of this, okay, you had a wonderful free education and everything, and if you made a career, but then you really had to work for the state.
Yeah, but you were working. You were doing what you loved anyway. You were conducting a Beethoven symphony, or you were playing Bach pieces. And we may get to it, but Schornsheim, I believe, says, I'm not thinking about socialism, real socialism, while I'm playing a piece of music. It's part of the, you know, I remember that, well, I don't remember, I remember being told on the day or eve of the Russian invasion into Afghanistan, the Red Army Choir sang in the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And it was a rousing show, and they got a standing ovation, and that was propaganda. That was, you know, if someone can be so artistic and so good, it can't be all bad. And I think my teacher at the time rightly remarked, if they do it, it's called propaganda. If you do it, it's called cultural diplomacy. And other states weren't beneath doing the same thing. You know, the Americans sent their artists abroad to spread their message of, you know, presumably liberty and freedom. And the Russians did that, or the Soviets, and so did the GDR.
And interesting that we have the same discussion even today, no? With the Russian war against the Ukraine and or Putin push out Russian artists.
We've had that discussion before the GDR in Germany during Nazi Germany. And what did it mean if you stayed? Were you automatically guilty if you performed Beethoven and the Nazis were in the audience, or they used that for their propaganda? It's a tricky question, and a lot of these people, especially the conductors that I've read about, they knew that perfectly well, because a lot of the early GDR conductors, Hermann Abendroth was a very important person in the beginning, Franz Konvichny, a lot of them were members of the Nazi Party.
Okay.
And they were too impatient to wait until they got clearance to work in the West, and the East needed them. So they got to start their career a lot earlier, in 1946 generally, in the GDR. So actually some of the most important early GDR conductors had already, you know, willingly or not, participated in that in Nazi Germany. Sanderling is a different case. As a Jew, he had to flee Nazi Germany. And then he came to Leningrad.
You have a wonderful book here from Sanderling.
It's actually really a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. His biography as told through a series of interviews. And he goes through his entire history and how he was reasonably welcomed in the Soviet Union, and he was very grateful, of course, because for him that meant surviving. And it wasn't until 1963 that Sanderling returned to East Germany, and the East Germans were desperate for conductors that were good, that had a status, and they knew about this guy vaguely, to some extent, who was performing with one of the great orchestras in the world, the Leningrad Philharmonic at the time. And so they constantly pushed for him to return, and he said, I would be willing to return, but I can't make that request. I owe them quite a bit. He was politically probably naive. He was very focused on his music. And it was around the time that Konvichny died. And Konvichny had all three major jobs in the GDR. He was the Staatskapelle Dresden, Staatskapelle Berlin, which was considered the best orchestra before the war, at least, head of the Berlin Philharmonic, and Gewandhaus. And they told Sanderling, you have the pick of the litter. And Sanderling ultimately decided, no, I want to take on a new orchestra, I want to build an orchestra. And that was then the BSO, Berlin Symphony Orchestra, which was supposed to be the symphonic orchestra for the GDR, the equivalent of the Philharmonic, because all the other ones were theater orchestras, essentially. And he signed up for this. And then, of course, right after he started, the wall was built.
Okay.
And with that meant all the West German musicians left all the orchestras. So now the Staatskapelle, the radio orchestra, had a big exodus of musicians, and the politicians in the GDR said, okay, the Staatskapelle is our top orchestra, they get to pick who they want from the other orchestras, and then the other orchestras get to pick from all the radio orchestras who they want to replace those people, and the BSO was left with nothing.
Okay.
And then Sanderling had to go out and find students, basically, to fill the jobs that he needed, but then he had a very young orchestra that he could mold. And then within over the course of, I think, 16 years, he turned the orchestra, which is now the Concerthaus Orchestra, into a fine ensemble, made lots of recordings.
Yeah, with this, as you say, with this orchestra left of nothing, we made later on this, the Brahms symphonies came over with Kurt Sanderling,
Right.
and the Berlin Symphony Orchestra, so that we are not only talking and so on, we just listen a bit now, how Mr. Sanderling does part of Brahms symphony.
And in Brahms, was very important. When he fled, he only had 2 suitcases going into the Soviet Union, and he took 3 scores with him, and the complete Brahms symphonies were among them.
Ah, that's interesting, okay.
Sanderling, of course, did a lot of recordings. He was one of the few to do Sibelius. He was the conductor who conducted several Sibelius symphonies first in the Soviet Union, and he was the first one to do it in the GDR. And his cycle of Sibelius symphonies on a different label is excellent. His Shostakovich is excellent. There's a Bruckner 7th of his that I really love, but that was already in West Germany. And I put together a bunch of CDs of East German conductors that I particularly love. There is Herbert Kegel, your Beethoven guy, who recorded the East German Parsifal, and it's one of the fastest Parsifals on record. It's, I think, faster than Boulez, and it's very different from that mysteriously religious. It's almost anti-religious, which makes sense if it's the GDR's Parsifal. There is Kegel again, and that's in one of the actually very good GDR composers, Boris Blacher. That was a specialty of his, as was Orff, I believe. Kegel did a lot of Orff, which is interesting because Orff was a West German composer.
Yeah.
But that went well. Konvichny, of course, was the first great conductor of the GDR after Hermann Abendroth. And the Beethoven cycle with Konvichny is excellent with Leipzig. And he did a bunch of recordings of Wagner as well for the EMI. The Tannhäuser, I just recently listened to that. It's really, really good. Suttner. Suttner was Austrian, but he studied in Leipzig and he stayed there. So he was essentially a GDR conductor. And I love the Schubert cycle of Suttner's, which was recorded by VEB and by the Japanese. So I have the Denon version, which was recorded digitally then. One of the great Kapellmeister cycles of Schubert. And that was really the tradition that was prominent in the GDR, the Kapellmeister in the best sense, sort of all East German Sawalisches, and they all had their nicknames. Abendrot was said to be the Furtwängler of the GDR, and Kegel, with his penchant for contemporary music, was said to be the Herbert Michael Gielen of the GDR, and Konvitschny was just the general music director of the GDR. Suten's Mahler First with Dresden is just absolutely beautiful, dark, and meaty. And then Sanderling did a bunch of Mahler with, not actually a lot of Mahler, but the 9th and the 10th, interestingly enough, with his Berlin Symphony Orchestra. And those are also absolute wonderful recordings. And so I could go through several of these. Kurt Masur, of course, we haven't talked about, but that was probably of the younger generation. He was born in the 20s, late 20s, the great conductor for the GDR. It was an important figure. Of course, he became more important still in the times of upheaval when the Leipzig demonstrations were happening, and suddenly he thought that, hey, maybe I can make myself a name for a man of peace rather than a man of the government, because
Masur as the brass mating then is a man of peace, but we know other stories about it.
Right. I remember when Kurt Masur died, and I had an acquaintance in the Gewandhaus Orchestra, and I asked him, you must have colleagues that played with him a lot back in the days before the wall came down. I'd love to hear their stories about him. And by the way, even though he just died, it doesn't have to be all positive. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And he talked to people, and he came back to me and he said, I spoke to 4 people, and all of them said the things that we would want to say about Masur, we don't feel like we can say it, not at this point anyway. He was not just popular, let's put it that way. I mean, these people had a lot of power, simply, and of course they had to be afraid as well. Sanderling knew that if he said anything critical in a rehearsal, during the break of the rehearsal, he might already be called upstairs.
Innerhalb der DDR war es privilegiert, aber eigentlich ist, dass man reisen darf, kein Privileg. Es ist auch das, was vielen Künstlern dann kurz nach der Wende vorgeworfen wurde. Na, ihr wart ja sowieso privilegiert, ja. Das ist richtig, wir hatten das Privileg, dass wir reisen durften. Aber überlegen Sie sich doch mal bitte, was ist das für ein Privileg? Man durfte reisen, weil man als Künstler das Land vertreten hat. Ja? Als ich zu diesem Wettbewerb nach London gefahren bin. Und ich habe dann, beziehungsweise wir haben den Auftrag bekommen, über diese Reise einen Bericht zu schreiben. Also einen Bericht, wie das abgelaufen ist, und der musste dann an der Hochschule abgegeben werden, und den habe ich dann später in meinen Akten wiedergefunden, in meinen Stasi-Akten. Wir waren auch gehalten, immer wenn wir eine Runde weitergekommen sind, ja, dann bei der Botschaft in London anzurufen, um das dort mitzuteilen, und die sollten das dann offensichtlich in der DDR wieder irgendwie das Kulturministerium oder so mitteilen.
Ich hatte beispielsweise 3 Pässe. Einer war zumindest immer im Ministerium und wurde visiert. Ne? Für Gastspiele im kapitalistischen Ausland musste ich ja eine Agentin haben. Über die lief dann alles, und die kooperierte mit der Künstleragentur, und entweder rief die mich an oder die Künstleragentur, und blöde war bloß, wir mussten ja eigentlich immer festgelegte Routen fliegen. Über West-Berlin durften wir eigentlich nicht.
Eine Sicherheit, dass etwas stattfindet, konnte man wirklich bis zur letzten Minute nicht haben. Also es ist wirklich bis zur letzten Minute immer so gewesen, dass gebangt wurde, ob überhaupt die Möglichkeit rein organisatorisch dann besteht, zu reisen. Reisepass, den man sich unmittelbar vor so einer Reise dann abholen musste, dass er nicht fertig gewesen ist aus irgendwelchen Umständen heraus, dass dieses oder jenes einfach nicht funktioniert hat und dass die ganze Vorbereitung, die ja oft viele Wochen hat betragen, dass alles wie Schall und Rauch dann wie eine Seifenblase zerplatzt ist, weil irgendwie in diesem Apparat so ein Reisedokument dann zu bekommen, um Richtung Westen sich zu bewegen, weil irgendwas gefehlt hat. Und das war ein Umstand, der so häufig stattgefunden hat.
Yeah, this sounds like that also in the Western countries the GDR had their hands there on their artists, always under
supervision and surveillance.
And
of course, and the agency was not an agency you would go to, it was the GDR's agency for all the artists. Yeah. And they were a political instrument. Yeah. And they had to make sure that, so-and-so was allowed to go places, and then they looked at their file, and there's anything in the file that suggests that maybe they cannot go. But you would have conductors that, were planning to do a tour, and then suddenly some official says this person and that person can't go. And they would say, well, we can't leave without 2 timpanists. What are we going to do? And then sometimes they found someone who was willing to play ball, and there were always people, even among the officialdom, that you could talk to, and they said, okay, that sounds reasonable. But sometimes it just didn't work, and then you had a choice. Either you don't go, and then no one goes, and of course it was nice for these orchestras to play in the West, or you would say, okay, I'll find someone. I'll go to the university. I'll find a timpanist.
Yeah, we have to see this, I think, in 2 different sides. On the one side, especially the normal citizens in the GDR, they said, you all have a big privilege, you can go behind the wall and blah, 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 and the thing. But on the other hand, as we talked already before, they had to do this in order of the state. On the other side, there was always the danger that they also stayed then in the West, that they jump off the train or jump off. And we know some musicians, they used such a tour in the West and never come back.
Of course, that happened a lot, but the important musicians were privileged to a very considerable degree, precisely so that it would be less attractive for them to leave. And they got to do the music that they wanted to do. Whether the state thought that they were tools of propaganda or political diplomacy, it probably didn't matter as much to them. They were doing their jobs, and they were happy just to do music and not to be too politically involved. Eisler, for example, was asked many times to render over his Austrian passport, but he never did. And of course, it's a much nicer life in the GDR if you always know that you can, if you want to, go to Vienna for a weekend or so.
Eisler is a very good point now. Let's talk about the composers in the GDR or the music. I mean, was there a special repertoire they were playing, or and which composers we have to list on now, really, from famous composers?
Well, first of all, there are not that many famous composers of the latter half of the 20th century in any country. Mm-hmm. The GDR had obviously Eisler. That was the GDR composer, probably. Well known to most people, if not the music, but the name. Paul Dessau, again, 2 composers that Sanderling didn't care for. Boris Blacher was an important composer. It's always a question, what makes a GDR composer? Because if you were born by the time the GDR existed, then you didn't start composing until the 80s, and how much music do we know from the 80s? Very little. It was interesting to hear some of the names, a lot of them I'd never heard before, that Sanderling talked about in this book, that he was supposed to conduct, because that was GDR music.
But I found in this interview, sorry to interrupt you, Burkhard Glätzner, he's telling us, because honestly, I thought they would never play a Nono or Boulez or something in the GDR. I mean, this is all, let's say, Western decadent music, so you see this kind of things. Yeah? But Burkhard Glätzner tells me something totally different.
Wir waren in Leipzig bei Herbert Kegel, und Herbert Kegel hat mit dem Rundfunksymphonieorchester sehr viel neue Musik gemacht. Nun muss man dazu wissen, dass die Rundfunkorchester seinerzeit einen politischen Auftrag in Ost wie West hatten, neue Musik zu spielen. Die sind ja hoch bezahlt, subventioniert. Sie müssen ja nicht über Konzertkarten ihre Existenzberechtigung nachweisen, sondern es ist ein politischer Auftrag, die zeitgenössische Musik zu fördern. Und das hat Herbert Kegel ernst genommen und hat eben sehr breit aufgestellt neue Musik gemacht. Nicht nur die Musik, die man hören wollte, sondern auch Weltmusik, weltneue Musik. Wir haben Henzes Fluss der Medusa, wir haben Penderecki gespielt, wir haben Paul Dessau gespielt, wir haben Luigi Nono gespielt, wir haben konzertante Aufführungen von Alban Bergs Wozzeck gemacht, Schönberg, Moses und Aaron konzertant aufgeführt. Wir haben Bartók gespielt, der immerhin noch in den 50er, Anfang 60er Jahren als verbotene Musik galt. In dieses Klima bin ich sozusagen hineingekommen, und daraus entstand dann mit Friedrich Schenker zusammen die Gründung der Gruppe Neue Musik Hans Eisler, mit der wir dann über 100 Uraufführungen gemacht haben, Stücke in Auftrag gegeben haben, viele, viele Konzerte die ersten Jahre ohne Honorar gespielt haben, mit Partnern in Leipzig, die ganz aufgeschlossen waren. Wir haben dann sehr viel gespielt und haben dann viele Komponisten kennengelernt, die wir angesprochen haben, wichtige Komponisten, sowohl aus dem Ausland als aus der DDR. Für die DDR waren wir ein ganz wichtiges Ensemble, wo man neue Musik machen konnte, die nicht die neue Musik war, die vom Zentralkomitee und vom Komponistenverband vorgegeben war, sondern die eine freiere Umgang mit den Tönen hatte und nicht ein vorgefertigtes ästhetisches Modell bediente.
Coming back to the contemporary GDR composers, you know, Eisler, as you say already, he was hated or loved or something between. Or if you're talking about propaganda music in general, I mean, for the socialism in general, Eisler was the perfect one. No?
Right, and he was probably still the most popular one. A real problem was that if you were a composer and you were politically active and you were all in the right political positions, you could have your music played, whether it was mediocre or not. Mm-hmm. And so because it had to be played, a lot of really mediocre music was played. But that's not to say all of it is mediocre. And Sanderling was one of the few who said, I will only play something that I'm actually fully behind. Yeah. So he played, what is his name, Wagner-Régeny, whom I'd never heard of, but I realized, hey, you have a CD of his, and that's actually really interesting music, and it sounds good, and it's rather conservative.
I honestly also didn't know 10 years before Mr. Wagner-Régeny, but for that I was in Berlin during the recording session, and I made a short promotion video. We can watch now how it looks, how it sounds, and who Mr. Wagner-Régeny was.
Das ist jetzt bei Wagner-Régeny genauso. Das war ein Name, der mir völlig unbekannt war. Er war natürlich in dieser Zeit von vielen Einflüssen umgeben. Schreker ist richtig, aber genauso gut könnte man Schostakowitsch nennen. Was mich am meisten begeistert ist, dass es offensichtlich möglich gewesen ist, 1956, mitten in der Ulbricht-Zeit, ein Oratorium im Bach-Stil, das war eine Referenz an die Musiktradition, Johann Sebastian Bach, mit einem eingeschlossenen Vaterunser zu präsentieren. Wie man das damals ideologisch verbrämt und legitimiert hat, das ist mir noch nicht ganz klar, aber es war irgendwie möglich.
Okay, Jens, I would say very anhörbare Musik.
Very listenable, yes.
Okay, Jens, I would say very listenable music.
Surprised by beauty music.
Surprised, yeah, very beauty this music. Yeah. But surprised by the name, by the composer, and coming back to Eisler, I don't want to say it's only propaganda music. No, this is bullshit. I would say it's very social critic music, which is still very, very actual till today. You know,
is it?
Yeah, if you listen to, for example, now we can play our intro, our Krüppel Brigade, the Krüppel, how you say this, Krüppel Brigade?
Yeah, sure, the Krüppel Brigade.
If you're just listening a bit the first verse and so, you will see it's...
Die Krüppelgarde, die schönste Garde der Welt. Wir zählen fast 1 Milliarde, wenn man die Toten mitzählt. Die Toten können nicht mitgehen, die müssen im Grabe sein. Und wir können nicht den Schritt gehen, die Mehrzahl hat nur ein Bein.
Okay, I would say this is a kind of anti-war song.
It is anti-war, and some of these texts are just delightfully dark.
Yeah.
And really put their finger into the wound.
Yeah.
That's not yet real socialism propaganda. That's just anti-war, and that's a lot of the sentiment of the GDR was, of course, born out of being the good Germany and not letting something like that happen again.
But anyway, I think we're going to make an own podcast about Mr. Eisler because we have so much repertoire, so many things from him.
Do you have any other composers from the GDR that stand out to you that you remember? Oh, that's music that I really like.
Yeah, honestly, I like Dessau. Yes, I like Dessau very much, and I did some things about Dessau. And if I tell something I like Dessau, then I'm like, right. Don't come closer. He likes Dessau.
Well, pick something to convince me because I'm not yet convinced by Dessau.
I'm going to show you now what is it? In Memoriam Bertolt Brecht. Yeah, I will show you something nice. No, not nice because Brecht died. I will show you something nice in Memoriam Bertolt Brecht. Yeah.
It doesn't exactly jazz my bell, to be honest. But
I just learned from it's thin-lipped.
Maybe it seems, I don't know. Of course, the problem with judging music the first time you hear it, or if you're not familiar with it, is that you're going to get it wrong, and perhaps there's more depth to it.
No, there's one fantastic opera by Dessau I wanted to bring out already. Die Verurteilung des Lucullus.
The Judgment of Lucullus?
The Judgment of Lucullus, yeah. The Stuttgart Opera did it, but honestly, then I had to pay so much for the publisher rights, so it was not
possible. Well, maybe the price goes down.
Yeah. Not really possible, yeah. And on the other side, not only on this big orchestra things, but there is also Siegfried Matthus, and he made a string quartet, the Maiden and the Deaf. The opposite to Schubert. Okay. Schubert, the Totes und das Mädchen, and Matthus, the Maiden and the Deaf.
Yeah, Sanderling mentions Matthus. He was also important politically. And
Sanderling mentioned him, really?
Oh, several times, yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. That's interesting. I didn't...
And he seemed to have liked him as a person, at least.
Okay.
And he apparently also played some of his music.
Yeah. Yeah, but we cannot leave this podcast without talking about the famous boys choirs, the Thomaner Chor.
How about that's a different episode?
And the Leipzig Thomaner Chor and the Dresden Boys Choir.
But that's really it's a whole another podcast.
It might be another podcast.
Boys choirs or boys choirs of East Germany, the Bach tradition.
But there have been also boys choirs behind the wall.
Well, yeah.
So, but anyway, we could talk now about another 3 hours, 4 hours about the GDR. So,
And we'll do that at another time.
We will do that in another time. Thank you very much that you have been still our guest at Classical Discovery Podcast, and thank you, Jens, for all your professional input here.
Well, thank you, Joe, for all the other things.
Yes, thanks for the other things. See you next time. Bye-bye.